Welcome to CivilNet. We have a very prestigious international lawyer with us, joining us here in the studio. He is Professor Eric David. Professor, thank you for joining us. I'd like to introduce you to our guests so that they know who you are and what your background is. First of all, you're here to take part in the 8th annual Yerevan International IHL conference, and IHL is International Humanitarian Law. You are Professor Emeritus of the Free University of Brussels. You have conducted investigations into the respect of human rights and international humanitarian law in the occupied territories of Palestine, in Rwanda, the Philippines. You're also on the IHL Fact-Finding Commission. You have extensive experience in this field. For our viewers, could you please explain international humanitarian law so that we form the context of our conversation, and then we can move forward?
International humanitarian law, that we say in general, because it's easier, IHL. IHL is, in fact, this part of public international law which applies in an armed conflict. In other words, IHL does not apply in a situation of peace. It's only in an armed conflict that this branch, this part of public international law applies. Whereas human rights apply in times of peace, but also in times of war. The only difference is the fact that in times of war, you have a number of human rights which are not applicable because of the war. For instance, the right to life does not exist on the battlefield, of course, because people can kill each other more or less enthusiastically, if I may say. But of course, it does not exist. But as soon as the battle stops, human rights become again a reality, a legal reality that must be respected.
So in more simplistic terms, can we say that IHL regulates the conduct of war? IHL regulates the conduct of war, how war is conducted, where human rights sort of regulates or limits the exercise of power of governments and authorities to protect citizens.
Yes, it's quite exact what you say. It's quite correct. The only small amendment it's not an amendment, it's an addition, I would say, about what you said. It's the fact that human rights are not only duties or obligations of states towards citizens, but you can also say that human rights bind citizens between themselves. It's what we call the horizontal effect of human rights.
Professor, with the explosion of digital technology and the internet, today we get everything in sound bites. We know instantaneously when an earthquake occurs, or when there's a tsunami, or where there's a crime taking place, because people are using technology to disseminate and proliferate information. In that reality, today we are constantly bombarded with news coming from the Middle East and now in other parts of the world. As we saw last week in Paris, the Islamic State coordinated a number of attacks. 128 people were killed. A few days before then in Beirut, again, another explosion. A Russian jetliner being shot down, again, by ISIS. So when we hear these things, and before this sort of string of events, we kept seeing these beheadings, these horrific images that were coming to us via the internet. And we have the sense that there's an increase of violence in the world. As somebody who perhaps unfortunately deals with violence as a profession, can we say that it is in fact a more violent world that we're living in?
I have not the feeling that it's the case. I think that violence has always existed. It is a fundamental part of human beings. We are violent. We have to recognize that we are also able to have a peaceful attitudes, wonderful peaceful attitudes. For instance, the establishment of the ICRC and of the Red Cross societies in the world is an example. You have human rights NGOs who fight not violently but peacefully for respect of human rights and for the peace, show that in fact, yes, you have these two dimensions in men, violence on the one hand, and peace on the other hand. But I have not the feeling, from a statistical point of view, that the figures concerning the results of violence are worse today than they were during the last century or even the century before. If you think, for instance, of the massacre of the Taipings in China in the 19th century, it was not some dozens, some tens of dead people, but millions of people who were killed at the time. And all history is full of examples of the like. So I would not say that the world becomes more violent than it was before. But there is something which is really new, is the fact that when something occurs somewhere, everyone in the world is aware. Yes, exactly. And that's the real difference. It's this proximity with the event, with the knowledge of the event, which makes the whole difference.
Okay. Which
gives the feeling that the world becomes more violent, right. But I'm not sure that's the case.
Right. If we look at statistics, certainly.
Exactly.
But is it more difficult to manage? Whereas before, in traditional warfare, you knew who the actors were. Usually they were state actors, usually, perhaps I'm wrong here, they were state actors who were bound by international law, by treaties or conventions that they signed. Whereas today, we're seeing groups like the Islamic State who are not bound by any authority, it seems. The dimensions of the conflicts are transnational. They're not located in one part of the world. So how do you manage that? How do as an international lawyer?
Yes, it's not difficult, you know. Members of Daesh are bound by international law exactly as you and I are bound by international law, as states are bound, because international law does not only regulate the relationship between states or between states and international organizations, but also between states and citizens, and also between citizens themselves. In other words, Daesh is, of course, bound by the rules that you can find in public international law, irrespective of the fact that there are also the rules, the domestic rules, which apply to Daesh. From this point of view, there is no real peculiarity which is inherent to Daesh. No, Daesh is bound by these rules, but of course, because of its ideology, because of its doctrine, Daesh doesn't care. Look, the fact that you have these suicide bombers in Daesh, it's something which is really extraordinary. That somebody is prepared to kill himself just in the name of some ideas, of some ideologies. Of course, I'm among the people who say that it's completely stupid, but it exists. It's a case. And then, of course, we can be afraid, and we have to be afraid, because these people, I have a fancy for saying, thanks God, till now have only used very small ways. But if these people got a nuclear bomb, for instance, they would be able, because as they don't care about their own life, the life of others, kill everybody, God will recognize his creatures. But there was something which was already said by Simon de Montfort during the massacre of the Albigeois. It was a sect in the Middle Ages, beginning of the Renaissance in France. And when his soldiers asked him, should we also kill women and children? And his answer was, kill everybody. God will recognize his creatures. You see, with this kind of ideology, everything is possible, of course.
Okay, in this reality, therefore, organizations like the International Committee for the Red Cross, ICRC, should they engage with Daesh? Should they engage with ISIS? Because, you know, I've had other international lawyers here at CivilNet, and as things are with the law, it often depends, and it's a matter of interpretation sometimes. So should organizations reach out? Because, you know, there is the concept of we don't negotiate with terrorists. We don't sit around the table with terrorists. Should international organizations, bodies, try to sit around the table, or is it pointless?
Oh, yes, I think so. I'm sure that even if it looks impossible, you know, it's human mind. These people are not wild animals. They are human beings as you and I, and therefore, of course, the mind can change, and you can speak with these people. They can understand you, and maybe their view can change. It's like with any kind of criminal in general. Of course, it's always possible to discuss. I don't say that it's easy. It can be very difficult. It's always difficult to try to convince somebody who has very, very strong convictions, very strong feelings, and you have the feeling that nothing can change. As far as I'm concerned, in general, when I meet this sort of people, I say, okay, we don't speak the same language, so I don't want to insist in order to persuade you. But however, maybe I'm wrong. I'm sure I'm wrong, because I don't want to convert people. It's not my role, and it's not the things that I like to do. But I think that, yes, we must try to speak with them, because they are human beings. They have a mind, they have a brain, and it's possible, of course, to try to get some hearing with them, and they can hear what you said. No, I'm not totally pessimistic.
That's good to know. Professor, here in the region we have not been immune to conflicts. The Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is considered a frozen conflict, 20 years of a mostly self-regulated ceasefire, but we have seen a lot of tension on the border in recent years, especially in recent months. So I want to ask you about how IHL can be applied. The basis of IHL is this principle of distinction, which obliges parties to a conflict to adhere to a set of rules. When during a conflict you have a military objective. Now there can be collateral damage when you're attacking a military objective. If there are people, homes, schools in the vicinity, you can have deaths or damage. But when the civilian, the peaceful civilian, the individual, or a civilian object like a school, a home, or a hospital becomes the actual target, is that considered a war crime?
Yes. When voluntarily, intentionally, that's very important, a school or an hospital or even just the house of civilians is targeted as such, and knowingly, consciously, that there are civilians inside, it's a war crime. That's quite clear. Of course, it's different if a school or an hospital is used for military purposes. If you have people who fight from the hospital or from the school, that's quite different, because at that time it is true that the school or the hospital lost its statute, its immunity of a civilian object, or of a sanitary object. But even in that case, if it is allowed, according to IHL, if it is allowed to target this object, belligerents must always take care not to provoke excessive damages. If you compare the damages which could affect the civilians with the military advantage expected. There is this kind of proportionality which is very important, which is a fundamental rule of IHL. IHL is perfectly, it's quite clear that the authors who established the rules are realistic, and they know that during wars you have always collateral damages. But these damages must not be excessive. They are accepted to a certain level. Which level? No, you have no figures. There is no criteria. It's just according to, I would say, the mind of the judge. It's on a case by case that you can consider that damages are excessive or not.
Right. I understand the distinction. Particular case in point, about a month and a half ago, we had 3 civilian deaths along the state border with Armenia and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan military forces consistently fire upon villages that lie right along the border, not the line of contact, which I understand in international law is a completely different understanding. But this is the actual state border between 2 countries, Armenia and Azerbaijan, and we have civilian deaths, and we have schools that are being targeted. There's evidence. There's, you know, what happens? Who does anything about it? Does Armenia say that this is a war crime? Does IHL, does an international body come in and say these are war crimes? And then what's the process?
You know, in every legal problem, you have always a number of dimensions which appear. In the case you mentioned concerning shoots through the border, you have 2 things which come to my mind. First of all, you have the peaceful settlement of international dispute, and this peaceful settlement of international dispute, which is an obligation, it's according to Article 2, Paragraph 3 of the United Nations Charter. It's an obligation for states not to resort to force, but to peacefully settle their conflicts. And there is already there, if they don't try to settle peacefully the conflict, it's true that there is already the violation of fundamental obligation of public international law. And afterwards, you have then the application of IHL. And it's not because the first rule, which concern what we call lawyers, we call jus ad contra bellum. It's not because these rules have been violated that you must not respect then the rules of what we call jus in bello, IHL, in other words, that IHL must not be respected. It must be respected. But you know, it's very strange, it's very funny, because even if rules of IHL are respected, but if the damages which are caused, which are given to the enemy are a violation of the peaceful settlement of international disputes, anyway, it engages the responsibility of the state who did that. For instance, when in 1990 Iraq bombs the military planes of Kuwait, it's perfectly in compliance with IHL. But it's a violation, of course, of the basic rules of public international law, which forbids, of course, the resort to force. And then there is a responsibility of Iraq, and Iraq has been obliged to pay compensation for this loss, even if the loss was in compliance with IHL. Exactly.
You have a very complicated, intricate job and mind, I would say, Professor. This is very difficult, very complicated issues of...
No, at first sight you have the impression, because maybe you are not very familiar with, but it's not as complicated as I would say a taxation law or commercial law.
No, but it's not so black and white, as you mentioned yourself. I mean, it's left up to interpretation. It depends on the judge, it depends on the time, it depends on many things. And in that respect, you can't give me a clear answer. Not you personally, but in general, right? Because everything depends.
Yes, everything depends, but it's the case for everything. You can say, I don't see that studio something which could illustrate what I'm thinking of. But look, for instance, the difference between blue and green. It's not always self-evident. For some people, this color is blue. For other people, no, it's not blue, it's green. And you can discuss like
Certainly,
that.
But lives
so it's always a problem of interpretation of reality. And when you say that, you touch a very fundamental problem of human beings, that all of us were confronted with the reality of things and the way to name this reality. And of course, we have this fantastic possibility, thanks to our brain and the way we are made to specify the reality and to translate the material reality of things in words. And that's something which is really wonderful, more especially when it leads to artistic works, for instance, or things like that, or even to I don't know, love feelings from one man to another man, or a woman, doesn't matter, and so you think that's something which is what you see in law. In fact, it's something that you can apply in every aspect of life. I like you is not the same as I love you, for instance. Is it like, is it love? Well, it's the same with the law, of course. It's not very different. It's just, and that's, of course, what is fascinating, maybe, in our discipline, in this branch of thinking, because the law is, of course, the art of using the right word for a thing. But what is right for some is not for others. It depends.
It depends. And on that note, thank you very much, Professor, for taking the time while you're in Yerevan to have this very illuminating conversation with us. And I'd like to remind our viewers that my guest was Professor Eric David from the Free University of Brussels. Keep following CivilNet.